Thank you, Acting President. I rise to speak on this bill, and particularly in relation to the waste to energy component it addresses. The bill will cap the processing of certain types of hazardous waste in the waste to energy process, and I'm very glad to hear that. And I welcome that, and I welcome what the government is doing in the waste and recycling reforms in the bill. As Dr. Q was saying, there's recyclable material and non-recyclable material. And I'd like to see that the only material that's considered for the waste to energy process is the non-recyclable component. I welcome the government's promise of that's their goal of cutting waste by 15%. That's something. It's not enough. There's a huge amount of waste that's generated. I welcome their progress on food to organics, and that is progressing nicely throughout our municipal councils. But the whole purpose is, recycling and repurposing of our waste. Waste to energy forms a part of the circular economy concept, but it's not a concept that I have strongly promoted, but it's vital to our future. We cannot continue consuming and disposing of waste as if the Earth's resources are infinite. They're not. We're already pushing against capacity constraints in many areas, especially global pollution. CO2 pollution and plastics in the sea, many forms of pollution, and of course the extreme weather events we see locally and worldwide are undeniable. The climate is changing, the planet's warming, and people want action. And people were taking action, particularly when it came to recycling. They were diligently sorting their waste many years ago and allocating some of it to their recycling bins. Then they saw it taken away by people in a truck and they assumed it was all recycled, and the demand on this planet's resources were being reduced. People were doing their bit. Then the news broke that the system they relied on was actually not working. Recycling was not taking place as people expected. There were big gaps in the system. People were doing their bit, but the system was not. This system failure represents a major and damaging failure for the government. Not only this government, but it represented a breakdown of trust between the citizens and their government on what they saw was a vitally important issue. And I think that's recycling, and people were very enthusiastic about that many years ago. One aspect of this bill, as I said previously, is to set the framework for incinerating waste, the so-called waste to energy process. Not surprisingly, while good in theory, people do not want such incinerators near their places of abode. They are reluctant to trust regulations around such facilities, and who could blame them? The same people who oversaw the breakdown of recycling systems are the same who will be regulating the pollution and emissions from these incinerator facilities. I think in this regard it's appropriate to revisit the Environment and Planning Committee 2019 inquiry into waste and recycling management and what it said about incinerating waste. Now, I was on that committee, as so was Mr Mellon, Dr Ratnam, and Ms Taylor was on that committee too. Mr Davis was on that committee. One issue that was raised is that these incineration facilities require a steady supply of waste to be economically viable. And a number of environmental groups raised concern that this factor could mean that incineration technology would not be used as it should, as recommended by the committee, that is, as a last resort for waste disposal of what cannot be recycled. So the idea, and one that was very much backed by the report, was that there were many aspects to a circular economy, and that the disposal of waste by burning should be a last resort for that which cannot be recycled or reused. The Boomerang Alliance stated that high demand for incinerator feedstock would, and I quote, cannibalise any fledgling recycled materials recovery operation, end quote. I was glad to see Dr. Q talk about the situation that's happened in Europe where some recycling facilities, they were importing waste from overseas to meet the contract. So there is that potential. It has a potential to damage a fledgling recycling industry as it offers an easy way out. A let's burn it attitude will damage the core messaging around recycling. It's very important that waste to energy is implemented as a complementary process to recycling. It should not in any way replace recycling. I understand there are some models in Europe where burning is used as a last resort, and I believe we must stick as closely as possible to that model. An area of concern is, of course, the length of contracts to make privately owned waste-to-energy incinerators viable. We might be faced with a situation where waste incineration contracts will have to be a staggering 25 years in duration. No one knows what technological advances will have been made by then. There could be new processes, say in 10 years' time, that render the whole burning option unnecessary. Or we could by then have developed our nascent recycling industries and have a real circular economy, as recommended by the Recycling and Waste Inquiry report. You know, we could have eliminated a lot of plastic waste by then with any luck. Recommendations that have been accepted by the government from this report. So let's hope the government sticks with what they have said they are adopting and continues to progress that. You know, we will be stuck with long contracts otherwise, and a 25-year contract is a very long time to tie us into an incinerator. Lee Bell, a well-recognised researcher and commentator on issues to do with toxic materials, been in this field for over 25 years, told the committee that a long-term contract would negate the benefit of future inventions in this sector, but councils would be locked into long-term incineration contracts and the benefits of new inventions could not be so easily taken up. And Dr. Q rightly made reference to that too in his contribution. The Municipal Association of Victoria also submitted that long contracts and their demand for feedstock could produce perverse incentives to generate additional waste. And to cite Lee Bell again, he pointed to recent developments in Europe where incinerating waste is starting to fall out of favour. He said that Denmark and Sweden have imposed taxes on waste incineration due to its environmental impact, and other countries are proposing taxes on plastic waste incineration. And to quote the report, the Europeans now recognise that you cannot burn your way out of climate change, end quote. I now turn to the specific area of pollution from such facilities. The Boomerang Alliance told the committee that such waste-to-energy processes presented serious risks to human health and to the environment. And I quote again, the Boomerang Alliance, there is no thermal process to capture the embodied energy value of mixed waste that will not create significant pollution and toxic releases. Now, we have statements from the Victorian Government that any incinerator proposal must demonstrate it can meet strict environmental standards. We would expect nothing less. But the enforcer of such standards, the Environmental Protection Authority, has a credibility crisis in the eyes of the public. It's let the state down on a number of environmental issues, and it's been necessary for the government to intervene and shake things up there. Many submitters to our inquiry expressed concern about air monitoring mechanisms for emissions from waste technologies. The committee report said that strict and effective monitoring would be crucial to ensure public confidence. Public confidence in environmental protection in this state is not high, to say the least. Given the government's track record, when it comes to sites for such incinerators, when they're announced, the beleaguered western suburbs of Melbourne are probably where facilities are likely to be located. I know there are some other sites already under active consideration, but it can be confidently predicted that there'll be public outcry in the affected areas. It won't be put to a vote because very few would vote for it, so it's no surprise that any announcement for such sites will occur after the election. And a large union has expressed concerns about air quality monitoring. The Victorian branch of the Australian Nursing and Midwifery Federation contended that air standards are not being adequately monitored and enforced here in Victoria even now, and industry reassurances around pollution levels are unconvincing. Once again, going to Lee Bell, who told the inquiry, and I quote again, "To minimise the risks from airborne dioxin emissions from incinerators, we also require highly competent regulatory authorities with in-house technical expertise on monitoring and enforcement of persistent organic pollution emissions." End quote. Well, if you ask the general public if we had some highly competent regulatory authority with in-house technical expertise on monitoring and enforcement, then at best they'd say the jury's out. And at worst, the answer after some laughter would be no. The Victorian public has seen the EPA's track record on hazardous waste management and they're not impressed. And we turn to the Auditor-General's report of 2017 that found the EPA's limited monitoring coverage does not provide it with information on air quality for most of the state, including parts of metropolitan Melbourne. The report was also critical of the EPA's record on publicly reported data and described public confidence on the subject as having been undermined. The Auditor-General stated that improvements in EPA monitoring and management of emissions and pollutants were needed as a matter of urgency if waste-to-energy projects were to be launched. The report also cited evidence from the Boomerang Alliance to say that emissions from such projects, even if implemented properly, will never be zero emissions. They'll be reduced emissions. To quote the report, that is where you run into a whole lot of community problems. Some of the communities may already have highly polluted environments, which the waste-to-energy incinerator is adding to. And in the case of New South Wales, we have yet to see a scheme that gives full confidence that they can even meet the current emission limits with the current technologies they are proposing. Another issue identified in the report is that of dealing with community concern in regard to these incinerators. The report said adequate and meaningful consultation is needed to take into account public health and environmental concerns, and one can only hope that this will happen because clearly there's a lot of community concern. Now, the bill is essentially setting up a framework for waste incineration, but there are other more important aspects of a circular economy. Elimination of much of our plastic waste is really important. You know, proper labelling of plastics as to their method of disposal is essential, and a huge public education campaign on how to recycle properly. Which bin does the waste go into? I mean, I walk down the streets of local shopping centres and look in the waste bins. They have recycling and they have waste landfill. Both of them are identical in their composition. Both of them have coffee cups, lids, food containers, masks. There's no public effort to separate waste now, or very little, because people don't know how to do this. This is where the government should be aiming most of its attention in the circular economy. Product stewardship, where are we on that? Making less waste-producing products and implementing a mandatory percentage of recycled material into government acquisitions of furnishings, road, paving and building materials would be at least a big start. These are all things that should be done. The burning should be a last resort, because you set up the burning first, the temptation is to put it all in and burn it. So we really do need a cap on that. It's good there's a cap, but there's so many problems with relying on the waste-to-energy incinerators. You know, so selecting the sites are going to be complying with the standards. All of these things are going to be difficult for us, but it is something we have to tackle. So I welcome that aspect of the bill. There may be improvements to come on it. The other aspect of the bill, which allows Recycling Victoria to set a waste levy and supporting information sharing by Sustainability Australia, and the strengthening of the Environmental Protection Act 2017, with further addition of regulatory functions. All of those are worthy of support. So there's much to this bill. I wish it was more circular in its reference to the circular economy, not just talking about the disposal of last resort means, as I feel it should be. Thank you, Mr. President.